Welcome to our EOCT review module on the mechanisms of evolution. Evolution is defined as a change in the allele frequencies or genetic makeup of a population over time. During this module, you should complete the individual sections of your review packet. These will prepare you to participate in the interactive review following this demonstration. Key ideas included in this module are how Lamarck's view of the mechanism of evolution differed from Darwin's, the role of adaptations, variation, reproductive success, and heritability in evolution, several examples of evidence for evolution, the difference between structures that are homologous and those that are analogous and how this relates to evolution, the 3 ways that natural selection can alter allele frequencies, the major factors in nature that alter allele frequencies and bring about most evolutionary change, speciation, and the major patterns of macroevolution. A new era of biology began in 1859 when Charles Darwin published On the Origin of Species. The Origin of Species focused biologists' attention on the great diversity of organisms. In this manuscript, Darwin noted that current species are descendants of ancestral species. Charles Darwin's voyage on the HMS Beagle was important for the development of his theory of evolution by natural selection. Prior to this publication, many scientists viewed the Earth as relatively young and being inhabited by species that were unchanging. While innovative, Charles Darwin was not the first scientist to propose a mechanism for how organisms evolve. In the 1700s, Jean-Baptiste Lamarck developed a theory of evolution based on 2 principles. It is important to note the difference between the proposed evolutionary mechanisms of Darwin and Lamarck. As is illustrated in diagram A, Lamarck proposed the idea that parts of the body that are extensively used become larger and stronger, while those that are not used deteriorate. He assumed that characteristics acquired during an organism's lifetime could be passed on to the next generation. Darwin, on the other hand, proposed that evolution results in alleles being passed to the next generation in proportions different from their relative frequencies in the present generation. In diagram B, individuals with variations that are better suited to the environment tend to produce more offspring than those with variations that are less suited. Over time, according to Darwin, these favorable variations accumulate in the gene pool. During his voyage on the HMS Beagle, Darwin repeatedly made 2 major observations that led to 2 important inferences. Observation number 1, variation exists in nature and some of this variation is heritable. Observation number 2, organisms tend to produce more offspring than can survive given a limit to the available resources in a particular environment. This leads to a struggle for existence. Based on these observations, Darwin proposed that individuals with traits that are well suited to the environment tend to leave more offspring than those with traits that are not well suited, and over time, these favorable traits accumulate in the population as adaptation. An adaptation can be defined as any heritable characteristic that enhances an organism's ability to survive and reproduce in its environment. Adaptations are the result of evolution by natural selection. The diagram on the left illustrates that camouflage is an example of an evolutionary adaptation. In the diagram on the right, note that desert foxes have large ears which release heat. Arctic foxes have small ears which conserve body heat. These are also examples of evolutionary adaptation. The term fitness is used to describe an organism's reproductive success. To say that one organism is more fit than another indicates that, when compared, one of the organisms has a greater chance of reproducing in its environment based on heritable traits as compared to another member of the population that lacks this trait. Evolution is a testable theory that is supported by an overwhelming amount of scientific evidence. This evidence includes, but is not limited to, direct observations of evolutionary change. For example, the evolution of drug-resistant viruses and antibiotic-resistant bacteria. The fossil record, which shows that evolutionary changes have occurred over time and the origin of major new groups of organisms. Homologies. These are characteristics in related species that can have an underlying similarity even though they have very different functions. Convergent evolution. This explains why distantly related species can resemble one another. This type of evolution has taken place when two organisms develop similarities as they adapt to similar environmental challenges, not because they evolved from a common ancestor. Biogeography. This is the study of the geographic distribution of species. Interestingly, species in a discrete geographic area tend to be more closely related to each other than to species in distant geographic areas. Molecular genetic and homologies. Biochemical and genetic similarities, in particular DNA and protein sequences, provide powerful evidence for evolution and common ancestry. Homologous structures are anatomical signs of evolution. They are characteristics in related species that have an underlying similarity even though they have a very different function. A good example of homologous structures are the bones found in the forelimbs of mammals, each of which are now used for a variety of purposes but were present and used in the common ancestor for walking. Analogous structures are the result of convergent evolution. They are similar characteristics found in distantly related species. They have evolved in unrelated species due to similar environmental pressures. A good example of analogous structures are the torpedo shapes of a shark, a penguin, and a dolphin. These present a solution to movement through an aqueous environment and are not the result of close relatedness. Natural selection is the only mechanism that consistently causes adaptive evolution. Natural selection acts more directly on phenotypes and can alter the distribution of traits in three ways. Directional selection, illustrated by graph A, is the type of selection that shifts the overall makeup of the population by favoring variations that are at one extreme of the phenotypic range. The light and intermediate colored mice in this example are selected against, whereas the dark colored mice have an increased fitness. Disruptive selection, illustrated by graph B, is a type of selection that favors variance at both ends of a phenotypic distribution, meaning that selection is against the heterozygous phenotype. Stabilizing selection, illustrated by graph C, is a type of selection that removes extreme variance from the population and preserves the intermediate phenotype. The light and dark mice are selected against in this scenario, whereas the heterozygous mice have an increased fitness. While natural selection is the only mechanism that consistently leads to adaptive evolution, it is not the only mechanism by which allele frequencies can be altered. Other mechanisms of evolution include genetic drift, gene flow, and sexual selection. It is important to understand that these three mechanisms lead to a type of evolution that does not necessarily increase the fitness of an organism in its environment, and therefore do not generally result in adaptive evolution. Genetic drift is a mechanism of evolution described by the random, unpredictable fluctuation in allele frequencies from one generation to the next. The smaller the population, the greater the chance of genetic drift. This is a non-adaptive change in allele frequencies because genetic drift is equally likely to select for or against a trait that increases an organism's fitness. This means that, due to chance alone, a harmful allele is equally likely to become fixed in a population as a helpful allele. Two real-world examples of genetic drift include the founder effect and the bottleneck effect. In the founder effect, a few individuals become isolated from a larger population and establish a new population whose gene pool is not reflective of the variation found in the original source population. In the bottleneck effect, a sudden change in the environment drastically reduces the size of the population. The few survivors that pass through the bottleneck may have a gene pool that no longer reflects the original population's variation. Gene flow is a mechanism of evolution that occurs when a population gains or loses alleles by additions and or subtractions from the population. Examples of gene flow include immigration and emigration. Sexual selection is a type of natural selection that occurs when individuals with certain inherited characteristics are more likely than other individuals to obtain mates. In this type of selection, traits that are selected for increase mating success, but not necessarily survivability in the environment. Intrasexual selection is selection within the same sex. For example, some male animals compete against one another physically for access to females. Intersexual selection is selection between two sexes. For example, the bright plumage of a male peacock does not help it physically overcome rival males, but female peacocks tend to prefer male peacocks with bright plumage. Speciation is the process by which new species arise. It requires the presence of reproductive barriers that prevent members of a population from producing viable, fertile offspring. Macroevolution refers to evolutionary change above the species level. The rise and fall of groups of organisms reflect differences in speciation and extinction rates. Mass extinctions are characterized by a loss of large numbers of species in a relatively short period of time. These types of extinctions have resulted from global environmental changes that have caused the rate of extinction to increase dramatically. Adaptive radiations occur when many new species arise from a single common ancestor. This typically happens when a few organisms make their way to new, distant areas, or when environmental changes cause numerous extinctions, opening up ecological niches for survivors. A good example of adaptive radiations is the mass extinction of the dinosaurs and how it paved the way for the adaptive radiation of mammals millions of years ago. Three major patterns in macroevolution include divergent, convergent, and coevolution. Divergent evolution is the process of two or more related species becoming more and more dissimilar. In convergent evolution, unrelated species become more and more similar in appearance as they adapt to the same kind of environment. Coevolution is the joint change of two or more species in close interaction. For example, predators and their prey sometimes co-evolve. Gradualism is a pattern of evolution characterized by a slow, steady change over long periods of time. Punctuated equilibrium is a pattern of evolution in which long, stable periods are interrupted by brief periods of more rapid change. This rapid type of evolution typically occurs when new niches become available following a major change to the environment. Now that you have completed this review module, log on to your virtual textbook and organize this information into concept maps that can be used to study.